Exactly what goes into designing an exhibition?
Well, it's a rather elaborate process. I'd say first, and we're going to use this just as an example. First, I'll typically meet with the curators as to how they want to organize the show, meaning whether they want to go in maybe a chronological fashion or a thematic or by media. And right now we're in Canada Gallery, which is the typical space for special exhibitions. Once we've talked about a lot of elements, but mainly just about the art at this point, I'll go back to the floor plan and move some of these walls. One right behind you could end up in a different place, and it all depends on the flow, to try to create a flow to the exhibition that works well with the art and to help our public better understand the work. I have a model down in my office that's a scale model of this space. It's about a ½ inch to a foot, so it'll give you a pretty good idea on what the space will look like. And then I have a computer as well, and it's called Vectorworks. And after doing an initial layout on the Canada model, which I think visually it's easier to see what's going on in a 3D representation rather than the paper of the computer. And then I'll lay it out on the paper to see if it fits. And again, to see maybe we need to move certain walls around to accommodate a larger section or make a smaller section feel more intimate. And then we'll move on to color selections, but that's done very carefully, I would say. I mean, oftentimes we can go through 20 or 30 colors for an exhibition because we don't use the same color throughout the exhibition. You want to employ the use of color to help bring out the works and make them look their best. Certain colors in painting might be reflected in the walls very well or poorly, and the last thing we want to do is diminish the visual impact of the work. After that, we'll talk about spacing between the works, which might seem fairly which might not appear evident, I guess is what I'm really trying to say, because it's important for me to create a flow or a rhythm, and that rhythm isn't something that I really want you to be too conscious about. And that's partly about spacing, partly about placement of, let's say, 2D works and 3D works, and then color comes into play with that as well. Then after that, the lighting is probably the most important aspect at the end of the show, because without that you're not going to see the objects. And it's one of the more satisfying aspects too, because you can make the work sing depending on how you light it.
Are you also involved in the design of the labels and text panels as well?
To a certain extent, but a lot of that goes to our graphic design department with Leah and Cindy. But my input is always there, as well as the transom sign out front, which is at the front of Canada. We advertise the exhibition, and you typically as well, once inside Canada, that front wall is one of the more important walls or vistas throughout the exhibition, because it helps draw people in from Libby Court into Canada. And we'll also repeat that sort of thing on different axes within the gallery space to have a highlight there for you to essentially key in on and then look at the rest.
How difficult is it for you to plan it out without actually having the objects physically there when you're in the planning stages?
Good question. For a show as the Area Artist Show, it's typically something where it's designed after the works are here, because I don't really know what's going to be in the exhibition since this is a juried show. But for a lot of the other special exhibitions, we either have slides of the work, or, which we do in this instance as well, but much more in advance, or I go to the previous venue, meaning another museum that may currently be hosting the exhibition, and I'll go there with the curator so we can talk about what works there and what doesn't. And essentially, oftentimes we'll steal ideas too. There's some things that work really well. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can use maybe the same color for a certain work, or maybe we like the juxtaposition of certain works next to each other, and it really helps tremendously when you see one work in person as opposed to either on paper or through a computer image.
So Claude, what kind of training did you have to do to get the job of the exhibition designer? What kind of experiences do you have, and what kind of schooling?
I just had to pay the person who hired me
Oh,
a few $100.
okay.
And I got the job.
Well, there you go, kids.
Yeah.
So, Claude, what kind of educational background and experiences did you need before you could become an exhibition designer?
Well, I have an MFA in sculpture, and I think that's been a great help for me. I also worked doing installations with my own work, which helped, I think, facilitate a greater sense of space, which easily translated into what I'm doing now. I also worked at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., and I got to get my feet wet there, and that was a number of years ago, and then I took a break and was teaching for a while, and decided to come back into this area. As a result of that, though, I got to come into a pretty terrific museum, certainly, and have learned a lot along the way. There are some programs out there in universities, but they're not very extensive in there. They're few and far between, actually. A lot of it comes through experience, working on the job, maybe as an art handler in the beginning, taking some drafting classes, or would be one of the first steps I would recommend, and then to continue with an art education. Because the more familiar you are with the work, I think the easier it is to understand what curators are trying to do, in particular with an exhibition.
Mm-hmm.